Welcome to the Nanovation Podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to the Chi Foundation for their generous financial support. Hey listeners, it's Mike. I'm here to remind you to share the podcast with people you know who might like to hear more about nanoscience and nanotechnology. And I'll point out that we have a lot of listeners who know nothing about the fields. They might be engineers, they might be scientists in other disciplines, who find month after month listening to the show is a way to learn about nanoscience and nanotechnology without doing a lot of legwork. I also wanted to read another review. This one from Adam Jules. I don't think there's any relationship to the great James Prescott Joule of energy fame, but he writes, informative, funny, nonchalant, inspiring. I think that's a fantastic review. It's the kind of thing that could appear on a movie poster or a podcast poster, if that's a thing. So as I've said in the past, please, if you enjoy the show, leave a rating or write a review. Share it with your friends. That's how we expand our audience and reach more people. And with that, on with the show.
If you have a windmill or something that is creating a lot of power, then you would need some electronics that is able to do this very effectively. And silicon can do the job, but compound semiconductors can do it much better and using a much smaller size of a device.
That's Anna Fontcuberta in Morral, a professor of material science at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. She's an expert in the synthesis and characterization of nanostructures comprised of compound semiconductors, such as gallium arsenide, indium arsenide, or gallium nitride. In that clip, Anna is talking about how the large bandgap of gallium nitride, or GaN, makes it ideal for high-power applications. Compound semiconductors also beat traditional materials like silicon in other areas as well. Charges generally move more rapidly, which we take advantage of in cell phones. They also absorb and emit light more efficiently, which we already leverage in LEDs. We may one day also find these materials in our solar cells. We cover a lot of ground in our discussion, but somehow find time to talk about how academic research is different in Europe and the United States. We discuss how laboratories are structured, where funding comes from, and how that can influence the resulting research. Anna brings an intensity to her research that is hard to match, and it really comes through in our discussion. So, buckle up and enjoy the ride. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. So today it is my pleasure to have Anna Fontcuberta Morral from EPFL. She is associate professor and head of the Laboratory of Semiconductor Materials. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
For those who don't know, can you maybe fully say what EPFL stands for and where it's located?
So in French, EPFL is École polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne, which is it's a federal school of engineering in Lausanne. There are two federal schools in Switzerland. Federal means that these are highly subsidized by the federal government. And polytechnic is because it's a technical school, so it's like an institute of technology. And the other technical school, federal technical school, is in Zurich. That's the ETH Zurich.
I see. Right. Okay. And so Lausanne is in the west of Switzerland, and Zurich is in the east.
Yeah. Some people think Lausanne is in France, but it's in the French-speaking part of Switzerland.
Right. And I had the absolute luxury of visiting. You had a workshop there on semiconductor nanowires a few years ago, and it's just a phenomenal view from the city.
Yes.
Yeah, the Alps are gorgeous.
Yeah, right now they are full of snow, so it's a very beautiful view, yeah.
So you have these two federal institutes of technology. Are there any major differences between them in terms of what they focus on?
So thematically, it's not very different, but the philosophy behind the running of the school is very different. Our institution is more like more American style, I would say, more smaller labs, more dynamic groups, while in the other side, there are more bigger groups with a big professor, but then a huge lab with a lot of permanent people. While here we may have one person that is permanent, that an engineer or a research engineer or something like this. Well, in the German part of Switzerland, in ETH, they would have 2 or 3 permanent people. And many of them may have a PhD, which here is much more difficult to have someone permanent in the lab that has already a PhD.
Is that by design or just kind of historical?
It's by design. So our past president came from US. He was very young when he became president, and he designed that we look more like the US so that we're more dynamic and we can adapt better to the changes in research.
Well, while we're talking about it, can you do a little bit more description of the conventional view of research laboratories in Europe?
So, well, Europe is very heterogeneous, right? But in principle, the main model is that you would have either national research labs with people that only do research and they don't teach at university, or then you would have universities with a professor that has his or her own research group. And in certain countries, they will have a lot of base funding. Like in Germany or the Netherlands, they will have a base funding that is equivalent to several positions. So this means positions for technicians, research associates, or PhD students. This means that if they don't get any funding from external sources, they can still run the lab.
I'm jealous.
Yeah. So this is more or less like this. We also have a bit of this base funding. And this enables us to at least invest in new ideas that we don't have still results. So if we have a crazy idea that nobody would give funding for, we have this base funding to just invest in this, demonstrate that it's not a crazy idea. And once we have the first results, then we can write a proposal and get funded.
That's broadly in Europe or at EPFL?
It's more or less broadly in Europe. Then people will use the base funding for different things. People will use it to not write proposals. I mean, a minority of them, the very active researchers, they basically use to seed the ideas and get more funding afterwards.
And in general, the labs, and this doesn't seem to be the case at EPFL, but the labs in general are quite large and hierarchical. Is that true?
In most of the countries, the labs will will be hierarchical because there will be a large portion of permanent people that do research, and then it's organized in a hierarchy. So there's the boss and then some people below. It's not at EPFL. It used to be like this, but it's not like this anymore.
Right, and that, of course, contrasting to the EPFL or US version, which is a lab head, the professor, and a pretty flat structure. There may be a postdoc or two, but then a bunch of graduate students and very little permanence. I mean, you may have a postdoc for 1 or 2 years, but they move on after that.
Yeah, my lab is like this. So I have a research engineer because I have a lot of infrastructure. So I have 2 molecular beam epitaxy machines, and it's just impossible to run it just with PhD students because the PhD here also is short in compared to US. So right. I have 1 researcher that is permanent, but then the rest, I have 1 postdoc or 1.5 because the other one she's working at 40% only. So then the rest are PhD students. I like it like this because it's more dynamic, and I also like to see PhD students grow. I think it's amazing how good they get at research during the PhD, and I love seeing this.
Yeah, no, it's always impressive, and I'm always sad to see them go because they become really valuable to the lab.
Yeah, but that's a success, right? It's very sad,
of course.
Then one is happy about that. Yeah,
of course. Okay, so you talked about MBE systems. So why don't we start talking about your research? Mm-hmm. And you are an expert in 3,5 materials, and why don't you describe what those materials are and maybe contrast them to a material someone might know more about, like silicon.
So silicon is the main material for electronics. It is very useful because it's very abundant, and it has semiconducting properties. It means that we can tune the conductivity, for example, with doping or by illuminating it. It has also very good oxide. So by just reacting the silicon with oxygen, you will have an oxide that is very insulating. So like this, you can separate devices from themselves, and you add functionality to the silicon because you have the semiconductor part and the insulating part. It's a very good material, but it's not perfect in the sense it's not absorbing light very well. For several reasons, and means that if you want to make a solar cell with silicon, you need a very thick slab because the absorption is very, very low. It will be difficult to make it emit light for the same reason. And this means there are other semiconductor materials that are more functional in this sense. And these are called compound semiconductors. And compound because they're made of two different elements. And you can have different types of it. And the one we're working on mainly is called 3,5 compound semiconductors. It's because they're made of the column of the periodic table 3 and the column 5. So if you have the two 50% of each, then you would have a compound semiconductor. And examples are gallium arsenide, indium phosphide, indium antimonide, for example. Then you can combine these compound semiconductors and make you can combine several elements of the group 3 and several elements of the group 5, and then you will create even more complicated materials. You can really tailor the properties by just combining all of them. And this is very useful, for example, for lasers or for any application with light, like detectors, lasers, solar cells, will be very functional with these materials. Also, in these materials, the electrons or the charges move very fast. So if you want to have applications where you need the current to flow very fast and frictionless, then you will use also these materials.
So let's start there with electronics. So the mobilities are extremely high, and with the right kinds of hetero interfaces can be enormous. So where are these things used today? I mean, so you can make a fast device, but where do we use them?
For example, in your cell phone, you need to receive the waves that come from the cell phone repeaters, and you need someone to react to it very fast, and that's a small device that is there. Then the rest is silicon, but you have a small device made of gallium arsenide. Another thing that you may want to do a compound semiconductor, for example, gallium nitride, is, for example, for converting power. If you have a windmill or something that is creating a lot of power, then you would need some electronics that is able to do this very effectively. And silicon can do the job, but compound semiconductors can do it much better and using a much smaller size of a device. So this would be, for example, gallium nitride.
Right, and the idea here is that there's a much larger band gap for those materials, and so you can not use as much material. They're smaller, but still have the same voltage applied before they break down.
Yeah, and also, many of our lamps today are made of gallium nitride, solid-state lighting.
Right.
This has brought a lot of savings in energy. I mean, if you have lighting made of solid-state base, you will spare a lot of electricity.
So if I go to the store and buy lights for my home, they're all gallium nitride based?
I believe there is more and more of that, yeah. I don't know in US, but here for sure, yeah. I mean, they're much safer than these mercury lamps.
Oh, certainly, certainly. I should have someone on who knows a lot about LEDs. I don't know much about that, but we can certainly focus on the light matter interactions of 3,5s, which are much stronger, as you said, than silicon. And I know one area where you've spent some time has been in photovoltaics, trying to use these materials. Can you talk about that a bit?
So as I mentioned, so these materials are able to absorb light much more effectively. And it means that you need a much thinner slab to obtain good absorption. And in solar cells, we want light to be absorbed, to be transformed into a current. And not only current, but electrical power. And so the first step is to have a good absorber, and we have it with 3,5s, but they're extremely expensive. So they're very expensive because some of the elements of the group 3 are difficult to extract and quite expensive to extract, and there's not much of it. For example, indium, it's quite scarce in the earth crust. So one would try to use less of it. One way is to use nanostructures. And this was the beginning of the project where we tried to see how we can use nanostructures in the form of wires to absorb the light and make a solar cell. What we saw by just calculating what size of nanowires we will need is that, in fact, they're very good at absorbing light. It looks like light funnels into these wires, and so you also absorb the light that is around, should be around the nanowires, and it's not going around the nanowires, but just falling into it. And this makes like a kind of it looks like if you would have a lens on top of your nanostructures, concentrating the light on them. And this effect is very useful because it means that you can have an array of these materials, and you would have very few of them because you will just have nanostructures, and each of them will absorb the light that inside on top of them, but also around them.
So let me stop you real quick and tell people you should watch Anna's fantastic presentation at a recent World Economic Forum. I'll put that in the show notes so you can see this in a lot of detail. But just to kind of paint a picture for what these wires look like, imagine a bunch of street lamps, and the wire geometry, these are kind of pointing off of a planar surface. Because the wires funnel in light, you don't need as many street lamps effectively to collect all the sunlight that's incident on them. And so that is really valuable, as Anna's saying, with regard to the 3.5s, which may have some toxicity or abundance problems. And so reducing the amount of material, and it can be quite a bit, right, Anna?
It's about 1,000 times.
That's tremendous. Wow.
Which means that instead of having one solar cell, you with the same amount of material, you can have 1,000.
Wow. So that's 3 orders of magnitude, and that's due to this wire geometry that funnels the light. Can you talk a little bit more about why the wire does that?
That's a good question. So in fact, if you look at how light propagates in these like filamentary crystals, you can look at it as if the crystal would be like an optical fiber, and so the light can get trapped into the wire. But there are also some modes in which the light propagates that it's called leaky modes, which means that the light is mostly inside the wire, but it leaks a bit out of the structure. And these modes are the ones that couple very well to the light that is just in the air. And that's why the light gets coupled in, because of the existence of these leaky modes. And that's once it's coupled into the wire, then it stays there until it's absorbed.
I see. Okay. Are you still working on solar applications?
Yes, we are. And right now we're looking at another kind of compound materials. Yeah, they are more abundant than the 3.5s. These are compounds that are not 50-50. It's like zinc phosphide would be Zn3P2. And both zinc and phosphorus are very abundant. And so we look at both at the formation of nanowires and thin films, but basically we're trying to optimize the properties of these materials so they can be used as a compound semiconductor, so to make it even cheaper. So with this, we would decrease the price even of several orders of magnitudes again. So instead of 1,000 cells more, you would have maybe 1 million of cells more. So that's the next step. First, reducing the amount of material, and then going to optimize materials that could work like the expensive ones.
So this is interesting. So zinc is a group 2 material, and phosphorus, as you mentioned earlier, is group 5. And so this is an emerging area of materials research. For a long time, people have done 3.5s, which we talked about. They've done 2.6s, like cadmium telluride and its derivatives. And now there's this emerging interest in 2.5s and related compounds like zinc phosphide, primarily because they're more abundant, less toxic, etc., which is a huge benefit.
Oh, toxic? No, it is. I mean, it's rat poison. It is toxic, but
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but hopefully these devices are encapsulated, and you with so little material, and we encapsulate it with glass so that they are not toxic to anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I always like to remind people that, at least in the U.S., the number one solar cell manufacturer is a company called First Solar, and they make cadmium telluride solar cells. Yep. So whenever anyone has an argument against the new material and they say either it's toxic or not abundant enough, then you just point at First Solar and say they had cadmium, which is not so healthy in certain chemical forms, and tellurium, which is not so abundant. Okay, they're the number one solar manufacturer in the country.
Yep.
But so from a materials perspective, things like zinc phosphide are interesting because they were tried a long time ago and never were able to reach the performance levels of 3.5s or the other 2.6s, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I looked at the literature, and one of the things I thought it might be that one of the reasons is because there was not any substrate to grow on that would have the same lattice constant. So if this is the case, 30 years ago, there were many techniques that didn't exist like today. Today, this is not an issue. We know how to grow lattice mismatch materials. There is techniques that allow us to really circumvent this. So that's why I thought it's worth trying again and seeing if by using these techniques, one of them being nanowires, because with nanowires, you don't need to be completely lattice matched to the substrate. So by using these techniques, maybe we can get better materials.
Right. That would be fantastic. Why don't we talk about nanowires then? So we've kind of talked about them in the context of solar, but why don't we have a deeper discussion about what they are and how you might think about making them, the pros, the cons. So how do you make nanowires?
So nanowires are filamentary crystals with a very small diameter. So they look like hair or like grass. But just that the lateral dimensions are much smaller than the hair, so about also 1,000 times smaller than the hair. And what you can do them in two different ways. One of them is we start with the bulk material and then just sculpt down nanostructures by removing the material in between some islands, for example, and you just make nanocolumns in this way. This is called the top-down method. And bottom-up would be that you tell the atoms to organize in a way that they grow crystals like we see them in the geological museums in needles. And this you obtain by fostering certain growth directions. So you go into conditions that the atoms grow much faster in a certain crystalline direction. And there are several ways to do this. One of them is you use a metal a droplet to localize the growth and to make it the growth faster. This is called vapor-liquid-solid mechanism. Others is you just pattern a substrate and allow only growth in certain nanoscale islands. So you can use all these ways to make nanowires, and different methods will help you do different kinds of structures. The advantage is that you can change the composition in all directions. So basically you can change the material composition along the wire or across the wire, and this allows you to, it gives you a lot of design freedom into making your materials. And this has a lot of advantages in many kinds of devices. So basically you have opportunities of mixing materials in ways that you would never imagine before. So for a material scientist, it's just the dream. It's just paradise.
And so when you say mixing and matching materials, you mean more for the bottom-up techniques?
Yes. The top-down is a bit more difficult because you start with what you have.
Right. And our capabilities with top-down are pretty tremendous as well. But there are still limitations in certain applications where, like solar, where you would unlikely to use top-down because you'd be removing so much material, and at the scale of producing solar cells that cover all of Switzerland, for example, you would not want to waste that much material. So you have to be careful with choosing a synthetic technique. Mm-hmm. And bottom-up would win in those cases. And also, as you're pointing out really well, that the ability to combine different compositions along a nanostructure is really critical. And there's different ways to do that. One of the things I run into all the time, Anna, at least here in the U.S., is people say, well, nanowires aren't going to be useful for anything. I don't know what your experience is, but
they're already useful. I mean, they're in your computer. Our computer is made of transistors that are made of nanowires. They're super small. They're smaller than the nanowires I do in the lab.
Right. No, I agree. You're preaching to the choir, but they'll say, well, that's top down, and I think, and that's fine. And that bottom up is either too hard or, we're never going to get the functionality that those of us in the community promise, or there's a whole bunch of reasons I've heard. I think a lot of people just got bored with them. I don't know. But what I try and impress upon them is it's not so much the 1D geometry, although, in some applications like solar, it's really great because it incouples light really efficiently. But it's this ability to encode composition along the length or along some direction that's really important. And any functional device has different regions of different compositions, and that's what gives it its functionality. And so if you want to have advanced devices, you need to be able to do this. And so these bottom-up techniques are really valuable from that perspective.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, I think maybe there's less hype because it became also part of a technique that many people know about. And so people, maybe they're focused more on certain applications, and they use nanowires. They use this capability of changing the composition in several directions. But they focus more on the applications and less on the nanowire form. But if you look at international conference like MRS, you find nanowires nearly in every symposium.
Right. And so this may be worth kind of talking about a bit more. I wonder where we're going. And I actually think the work with new materials like zinc phosphide is really fantastic. And I think these growth techniques are not limited fundamentally to the materials we've looked at so far. It's just that those are the ones that worked the best in the beginning. And as we learn more about them, we should be able to do a better job accessing other materials because we can control the process better, right? Mm-hmm. And that's probably one of the reasons why you could even attempt to grow something like zinc phosphide and control its composition along the length, is that we've learned so much from the other materials that we can now extend it to others.
Yeah, and that's where fundamental understanding shows its strengths. If you understand well a process, you can generalize it and apply it to other systems.
Right, exactly. I mean, I just saw another nice paper on, this was lead iodide nanowires. Yeah. Right, you're familiar with this from the Cahoon group.
Yeah.
And that's the same kind of thing. And I'm personally very excited to see new materials, the ability to synthesize new materials emerge over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. And I think people come back to this and say, oh, we kind of sold it short. There really is a lot here. In many ways, I view it like thin film deposition, mm-hmm. right? It's so basic of a technique. We're talking about making materials. So no one would ever say, I'm bored of thin film deposition. That's kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But that's what we hear about nanowires for whatever reason. And I think it's partially because people don't realize it's as foundational a technique as it is.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect that we didn't talk about is the fact that because of the small dimensions and the fact that you have a lot of surface with respect to the volume of material, you can have also other crystal phases that would not be accessible in the bulk form, or they would be accessible in extreme conditions. And so having other crystalline phases also opens up, every crystalline phase has different properties. So this is another way of how one can obtain new properties with the same composition.
Right.
And this is something that doesn't exist otherwise.
Exactly. And I'm a chemical engineer, as you know, and so I have a lot of interest in making lots of material. And I actually think that's one of the things where we have not yet even scratched the surface of these materials, is in entirely new applications where semiconductors have never really been before, mm-hmm. Because they've always been these bulk substrates, that they've always been rigid. And I think in the next 10 years, we'll see lots more applications that are enabled by both the composition tuning, the new properties that you were just mentioning, and the ability to produce these kinds of materials and devices on scales that haven't really been possible in the past. Mm. And it's just kind of hard to figure out what those things will be until you give someone a pile of nanowires and say, you should try interfacing with this cell over here or something like that, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, I agree.
So let's talk about the other growth mechanism. So VLS with this seed droplet, this liquid, where precursors are delivered to it, or sorry, in my case, they're precursors. In your case, they're atoms, because you do MBE mostly, and they accumulate and concentrate in that seed particle, and then the single crystalline nanowire precipitates and continues to grow. And so you've also done really elegant work without a seed particle. So can you talk about that a bit more and what kinds of things you're interested in there?
What we have done here is so we get the substrate, we pattern it in 2 different materials. So let's say we make a thin layer of an oxide, which means that if we have an oxide, when we send the atoms to grow, they will not stick there. So it will be like inert place for where growth doesn't happen. Then we make small openings, and then growth will happen only there. And also in these conditions, we can find ways that the atoms will pile up, making like nanowalls. And this can be very useful because then if we change the composition, thanks to the small dimensions of the nanowalls, we can again have materials that wouldn't grow on top of each other. And what we have shown recently, it is a paper that is still in review, but one can find it in arXiv, is that you can, if you grow on top of these nanowalls, you send atoms of a material that has a very different lattice constant. Then the atoms will wander around and will find the position that is more energetically favorable, and that's the top of the nanowall. And this creates an horizontal nanowire, and it's single crystalline. Means it's nearly perfect, and it's very nice because basically you can make scalable networks on a substrate, which means you can think about all kinds of circuits with these nanowires. And these combined with the current power of patterning in electronics, it makes you dream of having really 3/5 on silicon. It really makes you dream of whatever you can have on that.
I see. So the idea is you would take a silicon substrate, put an oxide down, then open up regions and selectively grow these walls in that region. And then once you have that, you can deposit other materials on top and then interconnect.
Yeah. And so we have shown right now, this is the networks are really can be made infinite with when the substrate is gallium arsenide. But the next step is to do it on silicon.
Oh, I see. Okay. So what is the material you're depositing on top of the wall?
It's indium arsenide. So indium arsenide, if you grow it on gallium arsenide substrate, the lattice mismatch is so huge that you will, after the monolayer of atoms, the strain will be so huge that you will create islands that are known as quantum dots. If you do it on a nanowall, basically, instead of having these nano islands everywhere, the atoms will just gather up at the top of the wall and make a nanowire.
That's cool. And so let's take a step back. When you grow the nanowall, because you don't have this seed droplet like you do in VLS that directs crystallization at a certain location, how do you tune it such that you get growth vertically of this wall?
We tune the fluxes of the different atoms. And we grow under conditions where the certain facets are very stable so that you have no growth there. And this would be the lateral facets that are parallel to the slit. So we have a certain base pressure of arsenic that doesn't allow these facets to grow. And basically you grow perpendicular to it because the other are like, let's say, you can imagine like as they are passivated. And so there's no new atoms that can incorporate. And then the atoms just incorporate at the top facet. And that's how the material grows.
I see. Okay. How general is that in terms of like if I wanted to do indium arsenide or pick another material, how hard is it to translate what you've done with the, I guess, gallium arsenide nanowalls to one of the other materials?
I think it's very general, and one has to look at what we call the chemical potentials of each facet to know how the grow conditions have to be tuned. But I think it is very general, and we're trying to. So one of the next steps is to translate it to other materials so that we can have the whole palette of compound semiconductors and be able to address different kinds of applications with that, yeah.
Let's talk a bit about, I really think for people who are listening, and I should say that there are listeners across the world, it's pretty evenly split, Asia, US, Europe, etc. So you talked a little bit a minute ago about funding, and that in general in Europe, there's some base funding, and then you can use that, or basically, I guess that's what you're using to fund enough people to get early results that you can then go write a proposal to get more money. So who do you write those proposals to?
So in my case, there is the Swiss National Science Foundation. That's like NSF in the US. That's for basic science. So any fundamental project, any idea I have, I can send it to them. The number of proposals you can get is basically one. And if you have an idea that is very distinct, they can fund the second one. But it's limited to this. So it's not an infinite amount of projects that you can ask them.
And what's the size of that project, an average project?
It is difficult to say, but the statistics, so average, I would say it funds 2 PhD positions and some consumables.
Okay, cool.
It's never enough to fund all the consumables, so I also use the best funding for this. Otherwise, I should restrict the access of my students to the clean room.
Right.
And then there's Europe, so there's a European community. That even if Switzerland is not part of European community, we participate into the funding scheme. And so there you have training networks for PhDs. And this is usually big networks of partners that have an objective, and it's basically used to train young scientists, and that's how you get funding for PhD students. Or then there's this scheme that is called IDEAS, and it's the European Research Council, which is only for single PI projects, and it has to be breakthrough project. Yeah, there are different kinds. There are three. One is for the people that just graduated or graduated just a few years ago. That's a starting consolidator. Once you have a PhD between 7 and your PhD is between 7 and 12 years ago, and then there's the other for the older people, and this is about so between 1 million and 3 million euros for 5 years, up to 5 years, which is a luxury, I would say.
Yeah, right. So that's 3 to 5 million total over 5 years.
Yes, the success rates are about 5 to 7%.
Okay. So I'm curious, if Switzerland is not part of the EU technically, do they put in money into these programs?
They put money into these programs, yeah.
Okay. I figured that had to be the case, but
yeah. I mean, otherwise it's difficult, right? But also Israel is part of this, so Israel has also access to ERCs.
Right. I tell you, one of the things that I get somewhat frustrated by, and I don't really have a good way around it, is trying to build collaborations with colleagues in other countries. And I mean, I know if you think about it from the taxpayer perspective, U.S. taxpayers want to fund people in the U.S., but there is quite a bit of value with starting and advancing collaborations with people in other countries. People have techniques that are not available as readily in the U.S., and just they have different ideas, right? So but there's no real good funding mechanisms. There's a handful here and there, but there's not a large sum of money that's available for that kind of thing.
I agree with that, and it's a bit it's not great because science is international, and science grows because of the movement of ideas. And U.S. benefits from graduate students that have great education in Europe, either in the undergrad or as a PhD. And we also benefit from people that have been educated somewhere else. So there is already this issue that, some country pays the education of some person that then comes to your own country, right? Right. I think it should be a bit more facilitated, this circulation of people, because that's how science gets new ideas and how it gets breakthroughs. Each time you have someone coming from somewhere else with a different idea or a different background, that's how you get new things going on, yeah. And I agree, there's not enough schemes for that.
Right, and there's so few that it's not even worth pursuing. So what I end up doing 99% of the time is collaborating on the side with colleagues in Europe or somewhere else, and just trying to get the funds directly for one PI, i.e. me, projects, and then work on other things. But that only gets you so far. There are things where you might want to send a student and swap students even between labs in Europe and the U.S. And I think the U.S. Generally, not even just in science. Speaking for myself, I think there's tremendous value in this kind of diversity of thought and diversity of trying things, right? Basically, I mean, you don't know until you try, and so having more ideas and more people trying things is a good thing.
Well, there is this PIRE, PIRE program. There was just a competition last year, but there were very few proposals that earned. This is also an international cooperation scheme, but it was extremely competitive. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah, it's NSF. Were you part of a team?
Yes, I was part of a team, but basically the submitting university selected only one proposal to support. And so if your partner university is the top one, it's super tough already at the start, right? Right.
No, this happens a lot, and this is worth mentioning, actually, that and I struggle with this at Georgia Tech. So if anytime you're at a big institution and they have a limited submission, so for the PIRE program, and there's many others where the program manager says, we're only taking one proposal per university. Yeah. If you're at a university that's large with many, many, many faculty, well, then there's a big internal competition. Yeah. And they only send one. So Yeah, that's always something that struck me as odd, and I understand why they do it to minimize how much review they have to do, but I'd much rather a system where you can submit as many pre-proposals as you'd like.
Yep.
That there are a couple pages, and then let them pick which ones they're most interested in, and then do it that way versus what seems like a very arbitrary mechanism of telling universities there can only be one.
I agree. Yeah.
Are there any things like that in Europe where it's university or institutes limited?
No, in Europe not, but in Switzerland we have what it's called National Centers of Competences in Research. These are calls every 4 to 6 years, and these are programs that last 4 years and can be renewed twice. So this is a lot of, it's a big network. It can be, one, it's 35 PIs. And so it's a big thing. And there also they don't restrict the universities the number of applicants, but it's kind of encouraged that there is a pre-selection, because otherwise it's difficult to be fair with the judgment.
Right, sure, that makes sense. I have a question. So I'm going to end with 2 broad questions. What are your 4 a.m. moments? So what keeps you up at night?
Well, I try not to worry too much. I think worrying, I try to think about things, but I think worrying is not a good use of the time. I try to be as much positive as I can. I take care of my students, so if a thesis is not going in the right direction and I'm not able to supervise as I would like to, this may keep me awake. But these are rare moments, let's say.
It's funny that you mentioned this. You're the first person to say I don't worry when I've asked this question. And it's funny because scientists in general have to be optimistic, right? Because 95% of what we try and do doesn't work. So that's you would think that more people have the perspective that you have, that it is what it is, and I'm not going to stress out over it. But that's probably the healthy way to be. I'm sure it's the healthy way to be.
Maybe the naive way to be.
Well, but the best scientists are a little naive too, right? Because if you didn't try anything that you weren't sure was going to work 100%, then we'd never advance anything.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful that I'm naive, but I am naive a lot of the time, yeah. Then when I do it, I said, I didn't anticipate this and this, but okay, thanks God, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm grateful that I'm naive. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And the last thing I was going to ask you was, who have been your role models? Is there any people in your life that have kind of changed your trajectory or solidified some thinking for you about what you wanted to do or how you wanted to do things?
So one of the people that inspired me the most that inspired me in the way to not be afraid of starting new things, that we can all start new things and just think about it and find out how you want to do something and really not be afraid, just jump into the cold water and always be optimistic. This was Harry Atwater at Caltech, who I had the pleasure to work with in my postdoc period. So I think this has made a big footprint in my life. And then
you and I both, right?
Yes.
So we both, and I will say real quick that Harry is kind of a freak of nature, and kind of like you, Anna, that I think he gets like 3 hours of sleep a night and can, when you talk to him, he's still sharp as a tack and one of the smartest people I know.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah.
But this optimism and this thing of not being afraid of doing something new and start from scratch, this is, I'm very thankful for that because this, I've started many new things and this is, I think, in part thanks to his inspiration, yeah. And then, the person who hired me here at EPFL has also been a source of inspiration because of his way of doing very thorough things, thinking things very well through. So this is, he's actually the vice president of our university, and there is Mortensen, and he's been a great inspiration. I'm very thankful that he hired me and that he kind of mentored me a bit during my first years here at EPFL.
Well, great. We all have people that have helped us along the way. And Anna Fontcuberta y Morral, thank you so much for taking a few minutes today.
Yeah, see you soon.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at fillerlab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.